Yeah, me too. You're right. It is quite intuitive. By a controlled environment, greenhouses are typically what we mostly consider as a at least partially controlled environment. But in our case, we've taken it to the next level, which is a completely controlled environment. And by that, I mean light, quality, and quantity, carbon dioxide, temperature, humidity, nutrients, and water. So those are the 6.5 environment variables that I associate with farming. And the technical challenge that we've taken on in the context of space exploration, which is the mission that we're on. For the last 25 years at the University of Guelph, our program has been looking at technologies, horticultural management strategies under those conditions of controlled environment to reduce the mass and energy cost of long-term human space exploration.
So it sounds like you're really trying to control everything. I haven't heard that from, what was it, the Outer Limits, where they say we now control the horizontal and the vertical. And in your case, it's the air, the water, the lights, the temperature, humidity, CO2, maybe even more than that.
Well, yeah, indeed, pressure is another issue when you're going into space. The mass issue, the mass portion of the cost of space travel, mass and energy is the currency of space travel. Most people don't appreciate that you spend the money in our case, the Canadian economy. But to reduce the mass, we started 20 years ago trying to figure out how low you could take the pressure and still have plants providing all the functions of human life support, which is led mostly by food. Food determines how far from Earth we can go and how long we can stay. And oxygen, of course, and fresh water recycling and scrubbing our CO2 and making us feel good.
Absolutely. And so as you're doing your research, including the making you feel good, I guess that's why you do some cannabis research as well. I hear that makes you feel good.
well, we've spent the last 25 years pursuing a mission of standardizing the nutritional composition of food crops for human life support, so that you've all seen The Martian. If you haven't, go see it. But that arithmetic that Matt Damon is doing when he's trying to figure out how long he's going to live with his potatoes, that arithmetic is implicitly the work that we do with food production and trying to standardize so that you could predict the survivability of, say, a crew of 8 on the surface of Mars based on this much edible biomass being produced. That's our story. So having that technology developed to standardize and this is key, standardize the composition of nutritional compounds in plants, we are simply stepping a teeny bit sideways in the phyto-pharmaceutical sector, of which cannabis is a main player these days, and seeking to standardize the profile of medical compounds like THC and CBD, and the long list. There's over 500 compounds making up this plant's potential to contribute to medical science. And we're not going to get very far if you can't have the same thing each time you test it.
Well, in many horticulture applications, they might follow the same processes, might even have the same set points for their various systems from one facility to another. But oftentimes when those facilities are in different climates, they're not able to actually reproduce the same results. And I'm assuming that your research that is meant to produce the exact same results in space. So how do you do that?
Well, you do it with high fidelity controlled environment. Those 6.5 environment variables that I listed, and I say half because light, quality, and quantity are sort of bulked in there. But the light quality, the color of the light, literally, is a very powerful tool in manipulating the expression of what we call secondary metabolites. And secondary metabolites are those things that give plants their taste, their color, their medicinal composition, and we can play a tune with the environment with very high fidelity controlled environment, and create conditions where we can replicate and reproduce that profile of medical compounds consistently. That's been the key.
So Mike, you're actually talking about minimizing the plasticity of the metabolites, essentially getting that consistent flower quality with all of those 500 plus compounds in different proportions and different amounts, and having the environment impact the proportion and amount of those that the plant produces. So your work is really on standardizing the production of that, both in food crops or as metabolites for phytopharmaceuticals. But when I look at a greenhouse and they talk about, say, a controlled environment, they might have a hysteresis of 10 or 20 degrees on their heating and cooling system. Would you consider that a controlled environment where you would expect reproducible results?
Personally, I would not be able to produce what I call medicinal or medical cannabis in a greenhouse or in a field or any place where I can't. Any greenhouse, I mean, this has been demonstrated over and over. My good friend Dedi Mieri from Israel at the Technion has done clinical trials and worked with the industry there for many years. And he cites an example in a talk that he gave once. He cites an example where he had this greenhouse grower supplying him with cannabis. And this was a reasonably sophisticated, by Israeli standards, which aren't that great, unfortunately, but grew the same genetic variety, the same cultivar in the same greenhouse throughout the seasons. And on one occasion, this kid who came to him, his mother brought this kid to him and put him into this clinical trial. This kid had epilepsy and many, scores of epileptic seizures daily. And instantly upon applying this, using this particular cannabis, it almost an instant cure, almost a miraculous cure. But some months later, the mother came back to Dedi and said, "Hey, it's not working anymore. You're giving me the same thing, the same prescription, if you will, but the seizures are back." And so Dedi used that as an anecdotal approach to assessing the profile of, in this case, the terpenes and mainly the cannabinoids and the terpenes, and looking at variations in the profiles of those compounds, and just teeny weeny little variations in that changed the efficacy, the outcome, the medical outcome of that plant. And it's because it was growing in January in the greenhouse in one case and June in the second case. So the seasonal change in incident radiation and other associated environment variables like humidity and temperature probably had such a profound influence on the plant that it no longer demonstrated efficacy in treating the epilepsy in this child. So that's an anecdotal context, but it demonstrates the you can have exactly the same genetics, and I've demonstrated this over and over again with various crops. You may have seen my lettuce picture, where I've got exactly the same genetics, the same F7 or F6 variety of this reddish lettuce, and growing it under red, white, and blue lights. And you demonstrate really profound differences in biomass accumulation, in color, in texture, in nutrient composition. So just manipulating the color of the light, everything else the same: nutrients, water, CO2, temperature, everything. Just the color of the light modified the secondary metabolites associated with color, anthocyanin accumulation, and taste. The grad students, of course, had to do a blind taste test, and with 100% reliability, pulled out that's the red one, that's the blue one, etc. The Nature of Things did a piece on this a year or so ago, and confirmed.
Well, I think that red lettuce is really a great example to use because, you know, compared to cannabis, lettuce is quite simple.
Oh yeah.
And yet, if you have the wrong spectrum for a genetically red lettuce plant, it doesn't come out red, it comes out green. Um,
Exactly.
and, you know, of course, many studies have been done, including yours, on how these different colors of light affect the anthocyan production and to the degree how red it gets. Um, I've also noticed with red lettuce in particular that there's other non-light aspects such as water stress that can affect the secondary metabolites. Is that something that you look at in your research or just light?
No, everything, we cover the waterfront. Since we have, you know, sort of godlike power over the environment variables, we can play a tune with all of them. We've done water stress. I mean, water relations was my foundation in science as a researcher a long time ago. And we've developed sensor technology that can help us directly measure the implications of drought stress, and we can directly measure on the plant, you know, with sort of 10-minute temporal resolution, the water status of the plant, and control it with feedback control, using that information as feedback control. So we, you know, it's been developed in applications for irrigation management, and you can imagine the long list of maintaining water status and how that would implicate the outcome for a plant. So we've used it on cannabis as well. Used these sensor techniques on cannabis and monitored water status through a wide range of different irrigation management strategies. There's a lot of anecdotal kind of approaches to irrigation management with cannabis, and we, you know, test drove a lot of these, and it showed quite clearly that some of them don't do what you think they do.
Interesting.
I was
Go ahead, David.
reading some of your research, Mike, or probably some that you assisted students with on drought stress. And there were extensive papers in the past on using drought stress to increase essential oils in things like savory or
Right.
rosemary, essential oils that are very common in some of these herbs. And those same principles were being studied and as a test to see whether we could manipulate the cannabinoid or the terpene profiles or amounts. And the research really did seem to show that using a controlled drought did absolutely increase the terpene and cannabinoid concentrations. Is research like that being becoming more commonplace amongst your graduate students and your program?
Absolutely. That we're uniquely equipped with some of these toys because we've developed them in many cases for applications in the space program, which has a different metric when it comes to cost and cost recovery. So the difficulty is historically in using drought or any environment variable. You can use, you know, you can restrict CO2, you can use temperature, humidity, of course, as it influences drought as well, because the environmental demand for moisture can be manipulated as well as the supply with your irrigation system. So if you're pushing and pulling at both ends, you can have some profound effects on the drought responses of the plant. And plants vary across the waterfront in terms of their mechanisms that they exploit to respond to drought. But uniformly, the influence on secondary metabolites, those critters that we're all pushing to grow, that THC and CBD are the biggies, it's clear that using drought is a potentially powerful mechanism. The big problem with it is, how do you give it exactly the same amount of drought stress to induce the same amount of response phytochemically in the evolution of the secondary metabolites, the compounds of interest? And that requires levels of technology that are not routinely available to the industry sector. We have them, we play with them. I wouldn't advise them as you know, you got to hold your head just so sometimes to get to understand what's going on. But we've developed ways to transfer that technology to sectors like the nursery sector for managing irrigation, where you don't have to use this instrument, this precise, finicky little pain of an instrument that was developed in our program years ago. And what we've done is correlate it with things like vapor pressure deficit, the environmental demand for moisture. So then whatever is not, I'm not going to get into the environmental physics here,
Right.
but nevertheless, correlating it with humidity or vapor pressure deficit in this case allows you to integrate that variable and use it as a feedback control mechanism to keep the plant within a certain range of expressing drought stress in this case, or any other kind of stress. The key is understanding how the plant integrates the environment variables.
Well, I think that we can all appreciate that in your research program, you have very high precision and capabilities that are not commercially available or viable for many growers. But the spectrum between, let's say, what you're doing and maybe something very common in the cannabis industry like hand watering is pretty large. There's a lot of steps in between there. So, you know, maybe you can help us get a sense as to, you know, where things should sort of come down. I mean, if you can't get as precise as you are, is hand watering good enough? Or, you know, maybe more precision than that is beneficial? Is there like some sort of 80-20 rule where we can get 80% of the way to the precision that you're doing and get the majority of the benefits? You know, can you give us some sense about that?
Yes, there is hope. I mean, even though we're, you know, the research end of things here is dealing with the sharp end of the research stick, and we're exploiting the most sophisticated technology we can possibly afford. And you're right, that is not economically viable in the industry sector. So we put a great deal of energy into developing technology transfer mechanisms. So ways to interpret the outcome of our research and transfer it economically and efficiently to the various industry sectors that we work with. And the most recent player in our sandbox is, of course, the phyto-pharmaceutical, the cannabis sector. And so we're paying very close attention to developing horticultural management strategies that can be replicated reliably and economically with lighting. The key to irrigation issues is automate it. If you get rid of hand watering, you cannot, unless you're a totally religious anal irrigator, you cannot replicate irrigation management. You'll have this huge sawtooth of stress and recovery. And the thing to understand completely is plants integrate their environment. They come to the table as a seed with a genetic complement that has the capability to respond and acclimate to a huge range of environment variables. And the manner in which they adapt or acclimate to the environment is how you get what you get in the plant at the end. And so if you give it the same recipe, the same integral of temperature, vapor pressure deficit, light, quality, and quantity, actually you can mess with the quality a little bit from the little sprout to the flowering plant. It has a different appetite for light spectra, and so you can play a tune with that a little bit. But remember that when you change the photosynthetic energy source, you change the way the plant eats. So you have to manipulate its nutrition concurrently with that. So, but the key is it integrates the environment. And if your environment is doing this, then the area under that curve is very difficult to replicate. So if you smooth out and have very regular and stable environment conditions under the various protocols that you end up with, your horticultural management strategies, then the plant that you get out of that is the sum total of all those integrated environment variables. I don't know if I'm making that clear, but the term integral is kind of a mathematical one, and it pisses people off sometimes, but
nobody wants to do math unless they have to, right?
I'm right there with you. No,
now, David, you've seen a lot of cannabis grows throughout the years in many parts of the country and even internationally. Is my understanding correct that a lot of them use independent control systems for different aspects of their grow that just happen to operate in the same environment but aren't exactly tied together?
Absolutely. It's incredibly common to have a lighting control system. A cooling control system might not even control the entire environment. It might just be literally trying to control cooling and heating with no respect to humidity. There are a lot of instances where people are putting in these piecemeal systems or doing a best of breed approach, trying to buy the best lighting, the best environmental control hardware, but then trying to integrate them together so that the environmental control knows what kind of lighting quality you're actually producing and putting down on the plants. Without that, I guess, communication between the different controllers, you really lose out on the ability to maximize the environment and also to reproduce it closely. And it is very common. So you're starting to see more work and more positions in the industry that are talked about as integrators, where the entire purpose of that job or position is to make sure all of the control systems are integrated and working together. But it's very uncommon still. And I would say, less than 30 or 40% of grows that I've been in have integrated control systems at all.
Well, I think there's a big desire in the industry to be able to apply some of the research that's happening to commercial settings. And, it sounds to me, Mike, like if you don't have one of these coordinated systems, it'll be difficult to apply some of your research because they need to be coordinated.
Not necessarily. You don't need an Argus control system necessarily, or the Cadillac versions of various integrated control systems. It certainly makes your job easier to achieve that standardized outcome. But what you're trying to do is those environment variables that I listed, light, CO2, temperature, humidity, nutrients, and water. What you're trying to do as a farmer is to homogenize those environment variables so that they're all the same all over. The aerial canopy has the same temperature, CO2, and humidity. And we're working on homogenizing light distribution in the plant canopy as well, because the top of the plant has a different profile of medical compounds than the buds at the bottom of the plant, because they have a different light environment. But we showed, must have been 15 years ago now, because we're developing this for the space program, we had exactly the same problem of homogenizing temperature, humidity, and CO2. And we started working on light back then as well with inner canopy lighting. But the big killer is humidity. The control systems that we beg, borrow, and steal from domestic industries and whatever terrestrial industries are based on temperature control. We as humans, temperature is what we sense most directly, and it has an explicit impact on our quality of life. And so all of the control systems that we steal from the domestic and industry sectors to apply to cannabis production in this case, or any plant production, they are largely based on sensing temperature and controlling temperature. Where if you have a greenhouse that's got 1,000 cannabis plants in it, or a space, a chamber, for example, not a greenhouse, you're growing medical cannabis. So you've got a space that's got, say, 1,000 cannabis plants in it. Most cultivars, when they're within the last 2 weeks of their production, they're pouring out about 1 liter of water a day, each plant. So 1,000 plants, that's a cubic meter of water in the air that you have to deal with. So the biggest problem that I see routinely across this industry, regardless of how sophisticated your environment control system is the poor homogeneity of aerial humidity and temperature, and ultimately then CO2. So all of the aerial environment variables that are critical, like temperature, humidity, and CO2, are all over the place from top to bottom of the plant, and you end up with humidity variations, and that's why you get fungal pathogens with high humidity. They propagate in low humidity, they disperse, etc. So you get that diurnal cycle routinely, and that's why you have fungal pathogens proliferate throughout these. If you had the same humidity everywhere all the time, you would never see fungal pathogens. They wouldn't like that. So,
well, I think that humidity is generally been the bane of indoor growers, and that's, I think, in a large part to deal with the fact that so much of the indoor growing industry leverages equipment and systems designed for people instead of plants. And obviously, I don't have to tell you, plants and people are different, especially when it comes to the air environment. And I think one of the things that's particularly challenging is these mechanical systems that are so typical for human buildings, namely air conditioners cool and dehumidify at the same time. Dehumidification equipment heats and dehumidifies at the same time. Neither one of these pieces of equipment can independently adjust temperature and relative humidity.
You're right.
And of course, that's exactly what we need with plants, is independent control of temperature and relative humidity.
Well, the way to is just to forget what you think you know about environmental engineering in the house, and instead of controlling temperature as your top priority, control humidity, because it's really easy to deal with heating the air up a teeny bit after you've cooled it down to take the water out. But if you're just controlling temperature, then there will be shoulders of on every day, dawn and dusk every day, where you're controlling temperature, but humidity has gone nuts. And so if you set your control system and have the appropriate infrastructure, so you size the condenser to deal with a cubic meter of water a day out of that system I described. If you then you can achieve what you think you want, which is homogeneous control of temperature and humidity, and then of course air distribution. That's the other biggie. You have to get the air moving inside, and I've seen places with all these big box fans and air conditioners stuck on the wall, and so many different variations of what not to do.
Yeah, just keep adding systems until the environment improves.
Until it breaks. So we were met with exactly this challenge in the space program, trying to have really high density production of plant material, because you want to get as much food out of every cubic centimeter as possible. Remember, food drives the equation. So we were trying to jam as many plants into as tight a space as possible. And the end result, of course, is you end up with massive humidity gradients, all kinds of horticultural problems, etc. So we solved all that for the space program. Now we're trying to shift that into the cannabis industry, and it's like pulling teeth. We're rolling this.
I think it is to a certain extent, but also, we have experience with a number of growers now who recognize the value in systems designed specifically for the air environment that you're going to encounter with plants. And for the viewers who don't understand these things, generally when it comes to the environmental side, we talk about sensible and latent loads, and generally sensible is related to temperature, and latent is related to the water load that's in the air. And what's very important to understand is that your average air conditioner designed for a building assumes a ratio of about 75% sensible load and about 25% latent load.
Exactly.
But if you look at your average grow facility, it's completely the opposite way. It's more like an 80% latent load and only about a 20% sensible load. And so that reality means that if you're using commercial off-the-shelf equipment, then you're sort of having to fight with your arms tied behind your back. You really need equipment that's designed specifically for the loads of a plant environment.
And the kinds of infrastructure you're talking about is the typical, equipment that came out of the basements of Vancouver over the last 50 years when we were trying to grow stuff in the black market kind of, an illegal approach. That technology does not transfer very smoothly to industrial scale, legal cannabis production. The rules are different, and you've identified exactly the issues in terms of temperature and humidity. And if you can homogenize the temperature and humidity in the aerial canopy of the plant, then CO2 will come along with that. It'll be equally homogenized. And now we're working on homogenizing light distribution. We've made some headway there. And we're looking at the light quality recipes and the intensity and coming up with lots of technical advances there as well. So the industry will slowly evolve in this. The medical cannabis industry must do it this way. And that message is a tough pill to swallow for the current generation, apparently.
It is, but with so much diversity in those compounds, and as you pointed out with your story earlier, the efficacy of the product can have huge influences or be hugely influenced by the environment it's cultivated in. And therefore, I expect every time I take Tylenol for it to have the same effect. It's medicine.
Yes.
And if I take medical cannabis, then I need it to have the same effect. If I am having seizures and it helps one time, it really needs to help me the next. Otherwise, it's a crapshoot. In fact, it's even dangerous. How do you know that what you're going to get the second time might not exacerbate the condition instead of make it better?
Yeah, cannabis is unlikely to make it worse. It's a pretty benign kind of, I haven't heard of anybody who ever got killed by cannabis, but so it's a pretty good critter to play with. But the issue is, and I was shocked to learn that the medical science community, I gave a talk in Germany a couple of years ago to a group largely made up of doctors, physicians, and they had the relatively, in my mind, naive perception that if somebody presented with an ailment that could be treated by cannabis, then they wrote a prescription for cannabis. Here you go. And of course, it doesn't work that way at all. Cannabis is hundreds of drugs potentially, and that is manipulated by the environment control. There's some impact of the genetics and breeding, and the industries across the country now are investing in genetics and breeding programs and tissue culture and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, you can still screw it up with your curing and drying. But here I am in the middle with the production strategy and the horticultural management and the environment control, and I rule. There's absolutely no question that I can take whatever genetics you bring to the table and turn them on their ear just by messing with the color of the light. So you have to have all three phases of producing the drug to be quite strictly controlled. I can say that curing and drying is a temperature and humidity control thing, and I think we can manage that without too much trouble. Mm-hmm. The breeding, bring me your cultivar with whatever situation it is, and then I will create the medicine with a high fidelity controlled environment that will yield the efficacy that's required in all the different applications. But here, the clinical trials need to be done. We're talking about the next 50 years of research and exploitation of the drug.
Mike, one thing that I just want to kind of surface about what you're talking about is that in relation to your ability to manipulate the plant with the environment, and you have the cultivars, which genetics, I've always described, determine a spectrum of what is potentially possible as an outcome, but environment is absolutely going to dictate where you land on that spectrum.
Yep.
And the more fidelity you have over that environmental control, the more closely you can approximate it. But one of the things that you're saying is kind of hitting a chord with me, and that's around the idea that something called the entourage effect. I know Deddy works a lot with the entourage effect.
And Meshulam,
you hear a lot about, people trying to grow cannabis in South America or, low cost in other countries. And then you also hear a lot of work being done domestically in North America on isolation and extraction of particular metabolites, whether that's CBG or CBD, whatever is in vogue. Yep. But I think what needs to at least have a discussion topic is that while it is fine to extract and isolate a particular compound, they do not in and of themselves have the kind of medical benefit that's often seen from the cornucopia or plethora of those metabolites in the different proportion and ratio. And that's why there's so many potential medicines there. Right. But do you think that we can get to a point where we can essentially, if you will, isolate all of the different 500 plus metabolites and then recombine them into a medicine that would have the same efficacy of the flower at a cost-effective rate? I mean, I understand it for these primary compounds where they're produced in large amounts, but when you're talking about, parts per billion on some of these other metabolites or even less, how does one do that efficiently at scale, or is really the only effective way to grow cannabis in a highly controlled environment to produce that medicine?
In the short term, yes, you need the technology that we have exploited in the space program to achieve that standardization outcome. Mm-hmm. In the longer term, and that just sort of runs to the end of the problem. In the longer term, there's an awful lot of biochemistry and pharmacology that the next couple of generations of research scientists in this plant are going to have to chew up and spit out. I can't conceive of requiring all 500. I think it's actually 530 or something now. It's the number grows. There's a heck of a lot of compounds in here, and over 140 cannabinoids alone. I can't imagine that you would have to extract and or synthesize each and every one of those, and then piecemeal, put them back together in a way that achieves, some medical efficacy. That would be, you couldn't do it. It would not be economically feasible to do that. And at the moment, the approach is to take the big guns, THC and CBD and a few other lesser cannabinoids and the odd terpene there, and create some form of, well, the problem is the FDA and their like around the world, they do not, in Western medicine, we do not allow anything other than a single compound to be identified as a drug. So you have to isolate, purify, and make a pill out of a single compound, like CBD has FDA approval south of the border for medical applications in epilepsy. And there is some efficacy there. There's no question in my mind that we can do it a hell of a lot better with more of the stuff that cannabis produces. Exactly which, that's somebody else's chore. That's the pharmacology that I don't do.
One of the things that I think that you said that's really relevant is this is multiple generations of research. For where we are today, we're just at a nascent stage of the cannabis understanding and cultivation in the entire industry. So for the next foreseeable future, really, it should be focused on controlling that environment with apparently humidity at the top of our priority list, and then being able to replicate those cultivation environments. You use the term high fidelity. I've always used granularly, but the idea is the same, that you want as minimized variation from cropping cycle to cropping cycle and as consistent an environmental profile, which is not just one aspect of temperature or CO2, but all of the environment as a whole, as a holistic idea.
Yeah.
And the closer we can get to that high fidelity reproduction, the higher quality medicine people can produce.
Exactly. And you know, we may be scaring people into thinking that, oh my God, I have to control, you know, 1/10 of a degree and 5 ppm CO2 and whatever, 100th of a kilopascal vapor pressure deficit. The plant is an extremely forgiving critter. And as long as you don't tease the edges of its genetic complement and tease the responses to specific environment variables like CO2, for example, beyond stress levels for extended periods throughout the production. You know, as long as you keep it within a reasonable window of temperature, humidity, CO2, et cetera, and nutrients and water, and pay attention to the horticultural management strategies that need to vary across from propagation through vegetative production, through flowering, and the different tools that we can bring to bear to really fine tune the expression of certain compounds. We know that we can manipulate certain frequencies of ultraviolet light and have a direct impact on THC production. THC, you know, the sunblock of the plant. So there's a lot to learn, and you're right, we're just at the bottom of the ladder. And the thing is that understanding, as we do now, just what we have taken out of the bank so far for technology and understanding plant environment interaction, I am confident that we can jump to the end of the requirement and produce a profoundly standardized medicinal crop, cannabis crop, right now, today. I'm absolutely certain we can do it. I do it routinely with a variety of different crops. And we're also working on cancer drugs in plants, and the same issue. It has to be the same. You have to standardize the expression of the compounds of interest in the plant. And you do that by standardizing the environment control. So it's a simple message.
So as we sort of pull back maybe to some more practical right now, people who are building facilities, you know, I would make the general statement that the vast majority of the people I've met in the cannabis industry, their number one concern is their lights. And I'll go further and say that I think the difference between the best lights in the business and maybe the rest of the lights is very little in terms of potential outcome, and that the environment is the thing that is very impactful that most people miss when they're focused and getting fixated on the lights. You know, based upon your research, you know, if somebody was going to get fixated on something, I know it's obviously better to take a holistic approach and think about everything, but if they were going to get fixated on something, you know, and you had to pick, would it be the environment? Would it be the lights? Would it be the growing media? You know, what is it that people, you know, should actually really focus on if they're not going to take a holistic approach?
Well, the lights are part of the environment, so you can't separate each of those individually. The humidity, the temperature and humidity, you can't disengage temperature and humidity control. You can't disengage light and CO2 control, and you can't disengage nutrients and water. So that's the way I think of the environment, is those three pairs of environment variables that are joined at the hip, each of them to each other, and also among themselves. So it is.
So it's a bit of a false choice, right?
Yeah.
You do have to look at it holistically. at the end of the
Well,
day.
yeah, and if you mess with the lights, remember, I mean, what we have sort of inherited from the industry of the last 50 years, however you want to describe it, what we have inherited is essentially high pressure sodium or metal halide lighting, or even in some cases, incandescent and fluorescent lighting combinations.
Oh.
You know, if you want to go back, way back, and that has given us the horticultural management practices that correlate with and work reasonably well with those photosynthetic energy inputs, and you know, all the relevant heat that comes from that. Just the whole horticulture management has evolved around those kinds of systems. Now we're going to industrial scale production, and the challenge of integrating the aerial environment is significantly greater, and the results of failing are huge, as we've seen.
Mike, can I just interject and ask a question? Because you talked about the kind of legacy lighting that came into the industry. As you know, early on was incandescent fluorescent, and then they did move to HIDs. I mean, I remember people talking about going and taking street lights down and literally wiring them and using those for the black market cultivation.
Right.
But currently, I think that a lot of us really see potential with the LED, the light emitting diodes, yet we have a huge backlash from commercial cultivators that really don't have faith in them. And,
Right.
you know, scientifically, when I'm looking at it, it's like you're saying, it's like quality and quantity. How many micromoles and at what particular spectra
Right.
are those energy produced? But to me, the idea that LEDs can't overcome the production or overtake the production capability of the HID or metal halides is just false. Yet there's a lot of growers that absolutely refuse to even think about trying LEDs.
Yeah. Well,
What is your
LEDs
take on that?
LEDs have they had a brief history in the cannabis industry. I don't know, probably about 20 years ago, maybe, you know, 15, 20 years ago, there was a little spurt of LED activity in the cannabis industry, and it failed miserably because the LED technology available 20 years ago just wasn't up to the task. You know, they would grow the crop and it wouldn't flower. Who knew? So basically, there was just too much technical ignorance about the application of that. So that is not the case today. And frankly, you know, we've been developing lighting systems for the space program for 25 years now. And 10 years ago or so, if you came to me and asked me, about 10 years ago when we first started 11, and asked me, you know, will LEDs meet the challenge of being your biological life support system energy source, of course, for food production in space, I would have said, I don't know, probably not. But in the course of the last decade, the technology has taken off like you wouldn't believe. It changes, its efficiency is going up, its price is going down. And unfortunately, the industry sector that you're referring to that are reluctant to dip their toe in the LED sea, it is partly the legacy of that failed effort 20 years ago. That the legacy of those anecdotes are still painful. So, but you're absolutely right. This industry, the medical industry, the medical cannabis industry, must use LED lights. We must be able to play a tune with the spectral quality so that we can achieve the outcomes that we desire in terms of profiles of medical compounds.
Greenhouses have seasonal variations in light quality and spectra throughout the year. HID lights have a fixed spectrum, which changes a little bit over time and diminishes in efficiency. But LEDs really, as you're describing, are increasing at a really phenomenal rate in terms of their efficacy and at the same time reducing in cost. There was actually a paper released quite recently that looked at the theoretical efficiency limitations for horticultural LEDs, because in the past, scientists have said, the theoretical limit for LED output is, 5-ish micromoles per joule.
Right.
But this paper actually went a little further, and they said, well, if we're looking at the photosynthetic spectral range and looking at trying to produce photosynthetic response, then we have to choose light quality a little bit differently. And it actually brought that theoretical limit down a little bit. And it talks about that. It's phenomenal research that's happening right now that's shaping the future of cannabis cultivation and closed environmental agriculture in general, and apparently the space program, our ability to leave the planet.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Earlier in the discussion, there was the topic of inner canopy lights that were brought up, and it seems like as we're talking about LEDs, we should come back to that, because that's LEDs are the enabler that has allowed inner canopy lights to really happen here. And David, I know you've done a good bit of research in using inner canopy lights with a variety of top lighting technologies, from LED to HBS, what have you. Maybe you can just talk about how we've really opened up a whole new world of lighting because of the LEDs.
Just really high level, sure. Essentially what we saw is growers were traditionally just trying to put down a higher light intensity on their plant canopy when they wanted more flower. And it got to the point now where, some of the growers in Colorado were putting over 100 watts of lighting per square foot onto their plants, which is hugely inefficient. Whereas with the LEDs, what we've been able to do is, because they are cooler, because the source of the light is distributed across the bar and it's a different type of mechanism making the light, we can introduce light inside the plant canopy. So you keep the micromole level on the top canopy the same, but instead of it diminishing with distance and the amount of leaf or biomass that shades out the other leaves from essentially getting access to that light, you introduce the light inside the plant canopy, which then allows all of that sub-canopy growth, that biomass, to photosynthesize. And I think, to Mike's earlier point, to have a more consistent chemical profile like the top flower, because they're actually getting the same energy. And so what we found is not only efficacy in terms of increased efficiency of using and delivering that light to where the plant is going to need it, and not just having to radiate it down and essentially lose it to the distribution as it spreads, but being able to direct it to the photosynthetic surfaces of the plant that actually were under lit and we're starving for light. There's some research now talking about when if there's not about 200 micromoles of light on a leaf, it's probably a vampire, a sink. It's drawing energy from the plant instead of having a net positive. And so introducing those intercanopies solved multiple problems. We didn't create as much heat on the top by just overlighting and trying to get penetration. And at the same time, we were able to get increased uniformity of the chemical profile and also show benefit on the yield. It's extremely efficacious in all regards. Mike, you've done intercanopy research, and not just on cannabis. What were your findings?
Exactly as you've said, you've zeroed in on the key there. We started doing that. It has to be 20 years ago now in space program, using intercanopy light. Now, you wouldn't believe the level of technology we had to develop to get light without heat into the inner canopy using, well, it's a long story, but anyway, it demonstrated the effect quite conclusively. And the bottom line is the main limitation when you jam a lot more light, if you're using just light, if you're playing with just light and forget CO2 and nutrition, then you will starve the plant. You'll push the plant beyond its limit because it doesn't have enough CO2 for the light that you're feeding it, and so it'll simply just plateau out. And also, if you push the photosynthetic chemistry, then you're also pushing the requirements for nutrients. And if they become limiting, or if you end up with a little water stress as a result, then the other environment variables can come to confound your outcome. So it turns out you don't really need that much light. You will saturate the photosynthetic chemistry of most plants between 300 and 700 micromoles. And that's, so in the middle there, we're talking about a quarter of full sunlight. With cannabis, I would say that if you've got enough economically produced lighting at the canopy level of about 500 or 600 micromoles, then use CO2 as your main tool to increase production. Just as an example, in peppers, for example, in our controlled environment, we had, it was either, 300 or 400 micromoles of light and 400 ppm, so ambient CO2. And we, if you doubled the light I think it was from 300 to 600, if you doubled the light, you increased the productivity by, I don't know, about 15%. If you increased the CO2 from 400 to 1200 at 300 micromoles of light, you doubled the productivity of the peppers, these sweet bell peppers. So
that's amazing.
With no increase in electricity, just a few more molecules of carbon dioxide, you can double the productivity under that. So those rules apply to every friggin' plant on this planet.
Matt, didn't you do some work with lettuce and that very subject of CO2 into relation with DLI and being able to really get that increased yield without having to add increased light?
Yeah, I mean, we saw that, you could go from something like 21 moles a day of light at ambient CO2 levels and go down to 16 to 17 moles of daily light at elevated CO2 levels, like around 1600 ppm. And so that shows you right there that you can get, a much more productive plant by understanding the limiting factor. Is it light? Is it CO2? The combination of the two. And I think we've talked about that in this call so far here, where we've said that as you increase light, other things become the limiting factor. And CO2 is one of the number ones that there's really no reason for, because it's so easy to add. And in fact, cheap, but I would also say, as you look at other things you might add, there's potential negatives associated with them. But, in the case of CO2, if you're at 400 parts per million or 1,000 parts per million or 2,000 parts per million, there's really no downside other than simply the cost of the CO2. There's only upside.
And if you're looking for a recipe, everybody wants to know the magic sauce, right? And it's different for every different plant, indeed almost for every different cultivar. It's different. They come to the table with a different set of borders around their response to the environment variables. But in general, if you've got about a quarter or a little more of full sunlight, so 500 or 600 micromoles, and about 1,000 to 1,200 ppm CO2, and temperatures in the early mid 20s, sort of 22, 3, 4, 5 in that area, and vapor pressure deficit or humidity control is always in RH, but the plant doesn't measure RH, it measures vapor pressure deficit. It measures the environmental demand for moisture. So somewhere in around a kilopascal of vapor pressure deficit, 0.8 to so, as long as it's stable, that's the key at those temperatures. And then you almost can't go wrong. The technical challenge is homogenizing all of that, making sure.
And making it reproducible.
Yes, every leaf has to see the same temperature, humidity, and CO2.
No microclimates.
That's another reason to think about intercanopy light, because so many people talk about uniformity on a 2D basis, but what about it on a 3-dimensional basis?
Hugely important. And we knew that, we saw that a quarter century ago in the space program, because we knew that we had to produce as much edible biomass in every cubic centimeter of the production space. And that meant that you had to get lights inside the plant canopy to enhance the biomass production, and in the case of medicinal plants, to enhance the homogeneity of the distribution of medical compounds.
Well, I think we're just getting started with this conversation. There's so much more to talk about, but we actually blew through our hour already, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, you guys need to come and kick the tires at the Controlled Environment Systems facility and just see the you know, the toys and the expertise that routinely wanders around the halls there. It's
well, that sounds like an invite, David.
Yeah, oh, that sounds I'll jump like on a plane tomorrow.
Yeah, as soon as this foolishness is behind us, damn, you know, I've been 11 weeks now doing video conferences from here and in the other room across the.
I just got back from my. Oh, sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
I've had enough.
Yeah, no, yes. It's time to get back to boots on the ground, hands in the dirt. And I got back from my first flight and travels just last night around midnight. But it was good to have that normalcy of going back to facilities and getting back to hands-on work. As much as I love communicating with everybody and all the listeners via the internet and Zoom, I think the most common phrase this year is going to be, your mic's not on. And I'm looking forward to looking people in the eye and not in the computer screen once again very soon.
I hear you.
That offer, Mike, we will be up in Guelph before you know it.
You do it.
All right. Well, we will look forward to seeing you in person, and we will try not to utter the phrase "you're on mute" when we see you in person, just as a natural tendency. Thanks so much for spending the time with us, and we definitely look forward to coming and visiting you in person and continuing this conversation, and we'll certainly find a way to make it available to all of our viewers as well. Thanks again for showing up today. And thank you, David, for joining me yet again. And we look forward to seeing everybody same time next week.
Okay, Matt. Bye.
All right.
Mike, cheers. Wonderful talking to you. Have a wonderful day. Thank you again. Take care, everybody.
Right. Bye-bye.